They want a bland conformity. I gave them vibrant anarchy. And that's how I, Alex Riley, declared war on the Windsor Heights HOA. You know, you buy a house in a place like this, a nice suburban slice of the American dream, and you think you're buying freedom. You're not. You're buying a membership to a club run by people who take their rulebook very seriously. For me, the trouble started with the kind of trivial detail only a petty tyrant would notice. A few flowers. My name is Alex Riley. I'm in my mid-30s. I work as a software architect, and up until recently I was a model, if slightly bored, citizen of Windsor Heights, Connecticut. It's the kind of neighborhood where the lawns are always immaculate, the house colors are strictly subdued, and if a leaf dares to fall out of season, someone reports it. Everything is perfectly ordered, perfectly predictable, and frankly, perfectly soul-crushing. I bought my 2-story colonial 5 years ago. It had a paint job that was a faded, soft pinka color that had been grudgingly approved decades ago but was now considered embarrassingly old money and, worse, just plain ugly by the current HOA board. I wanted peace, a backyard for grilling, and no fuss. But in Windsor Heights, no fuss is strictly defined by the Homeowners Association, the HOA, and the HOA is, in all practical terms, run by one woman. Her name is Victoria Sterling. Victoria isn't just the HOA president. She is the HOA's executive and judicial branch rolled into one neat, power-hungry package. She's a retired accountant, a woman whose entire personality is built on compliance, rigid spreadsheets, and the absolute elimination of anything that could be labeled as character. She possesses the kind of severe posture that could cut glass and eyes that can spot a misplaced recycling bin from a mile away. Victoria doesn't own a smile. She owns a permanent, judging frown. She sees her role not as a community manager, but as the self-appointed keeper of the aesthetic. If you deviate, even slightly, from the meticulously crafted, muted image of Windsor Heights, Victoria views it as a personal insult to her fiscal and moral authority. She protects the neighborhood's property values with the zeal of a medieval knight guarding the Holy Grail. She had recently set her sights on my front yard, specifically targeting the spot of faded pink I had failed to refresh. I decided my front flower bed needed some life to distract from the aging paint. So, I bought a couple of beautiful periwinkle blue hydrangeas. They were bright, healthy, and lovely, offering a sharp, welcome contrast to the faded pink wall behind them. I planted them right next to my walkway. About 3 days later, I found the first letter tucked into my mailbox. It wasn't a friendly note. It was a formal, laser-printed document from the HOA, citing Section 4, Subsection B, permitted flora and color saturation standards. Apparently, periwinkle blue was considered disruptive to the established color palette and was thus unauthorized flora. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud at the absurdity of being fined over the shade of a flower. I thought it was a joke. I was deeply, utterly wrong. I ignored the first letter, and the second one, which followed a week later, was angrier. It mentioned a fine, $50 per day until the offending flora was removed. I gave up. I dug up the hydrangeas. I wasn't looking for a war over flowers. I figured that was the end of it, a minor skirmish lost to the HOA bureaucracy. But Victoria Sterling doesn't forget, and she certainly doesn't forgive. A week after the hydrangeas were gone, I got a new letter. This one-sided Section 2, Subsection A, Clause 3, Exterior Maintenance and Paint Integrity. The letter stated that the spot where I had planted and then dug up the flowers had caused a minor but noticeable disturbance to the foundation stucco, and further, that a recent inspection had determined the entire house's paint that old, faded pink was below the specified luminescence standards and needed a refresh. It was a blatant power play. Victoria couldn't nail me on the flowers, so she went for the house itself. She was using a ridiculous technicality to punish me for my initial noncompliance and to force the removal of that old, unloved pink. She saw it as an opportunity to mandate one of her approved shades of gray or beige. I tried calling her. I tried emailing. I offered to patch the stucco myself, to repaint the front of the house in an acceptable color. I offered compromise. I received no human response, just more formal mail. And then came the final ultimatum. I opened the last envelope, the weight of the thick paper feeling heavy in my hand. It wasn't just a fine. It was a full-blown demand, printed in bold, uncompromising font, by the close of business on October 1, 2024. The property located at 14 Oakwood Lane must be entirely repainted with an approved color from the HOA's official palette guide pages 1 to 5. Failure to comply will result in a $5,000 penalty and commencement of a civil suit. I looked at the house. Faded pink. I looked at the attached palette guide. 50 shades of depressing off-white, light gray, and tan. I looked at the deadline. I had 2 weeks. Victoria Sterling wanted my complete and total submission. She wanted me to tuck my tail and repaint my perfectly fine house an identical, soul-crushing shade of neutrality. But as I stood there, holding that ridiculous, pompous threat in my hand, a different kind of thought bloomed, a brilliant, rebellious, and deeply mischievous thought. If they were going to force me to repaint, they were going to regret giving me a paintbrush and 2 weeks to think about it. Victoria Sterling's final notice didn't just feel like a threat. It felt like a poorly crafted trap. She demanded I repaint the house from its outdated, faded pink to an approved, utterly dull color from her palette. I reread the notice, specifically the part about the HOA palette guide. It was a booklet of 50 shades of muted misery, creams, tans, light grays, and the occasional ocean mist blue, all designed to make the neighborhood look like a collective corporate campus. The list of forbidden colors, however, was where Victoria made her critical error. It mentioned no unapproved earth tones and avoid overtly non-residential hues. It did not, explicitly, ban any particular color by name. Victoria's entire power structure relied on residents submitting to the spirit of the law, not examining the letter of it. If I was forced to repaint, I decided my rebellion wouldn't be subtle. It would be so loud and absurd that it would force the HOA to change its rules just to handle me. That was the goal, not just to win the battle, but to dismantle the system itself. My internal conflict was short-lived. For 10 minutes, I considered simply painting the house a slightly different shade of pink, one that technically skirted the violation. But then I imagined the look on Victoria's face, a look of mild annoyance, followed by another letter. No, this required an escalation, a declaration of independence visible from space. I drove straight to the largest paint depot outside of the county. I didn't ask for samples. I went straight for the industrial-grade color charts. I bypassed the reds to aggressive, the yellows to cheerful, and the greens to natural. I landed on purple, not a soft, gentle purple, but a violet so aggressive it seemed to hum under the fluorescent lights. The name was perfect, electric lilac, but a solid purple house was only half the plan. I spent another 30 minutes digging through industrial coatings, finally finding a glitter additive microscopic, weatherproof flakes usually used for novelty signage. I bought enough to cover the entire colonial. My house wasn't just going to be purple. It was going to be a shimmering, glittering monument to petty defiance. A disco ball of suburban descent. The painting was performance art. I hired a crew of young, enthusiastic painters who looked like they were getting paid to commit civil disobedience. I made sure to drape the entire house in huge, theatrical tarps. This created an intense level of suspense in Windsor Heights. Neighbors slowed their cars, peering over the top of the canvas, murmuring theories. I could imagine the internal monologue of Mrs. Peterson, the chief gossip, as she drove past. Is he painting it black? Oh my God, is it going to be a mural? All the while, behind the curtain, my house was transforming from a dated, boring pink into a psychedelic statement. For 3 days, I watched Victoria's black Mercedes cruise by every hour on the hour. I knew she was there, clipboard in hand, smugly ticking off the days until I revealed her boring, newly approved gray masterpiece. I could practically hear her thinking, the pink menace will be gone soon. The irony was delicious. On Saturday morning, the day of the reveal, the atmosphere was electric. The painting was complete. I checked my phone. 10 a.m. peak, dog walking, errand running, and neighbor gawking time. I gave the signal, and in a coordinated, dramatic effort, the crew yanked the tarps down. The sun hit the house like a spotlight. The electric lilac didn't just appear, it radiated. The glitter additive caught the sunlight, making the walls shimmer and flash, demanding attention. It looked like a giant, vibrant bruise on the pristine face of Windsor Heights. The house screamed with unapologetic, glittering defiance. A woman walking her poodle actually stopped mid-stride and covered her mouth. I heard the distinct squeal of tires as Mr. Peterson almost drove into a mailbox trying to get a better look. But the true reaction came when Victoria Sterling arrived. Her Mercedes pulled up slowly, the black shining almost as brightly as my purple walls. She stepped out in a crisp, beige suit, the visual opposite of my house clipboard firmly in hand. She walked toward the house slowly, her face a masterful blend of disbelief and mounting rage. She looked at the porch, the trim, the contrast of the bright color against the perfect green lawn. Her composure, the one thing she prized above all else, was cracking. Victoria didn't shout or scream. She did something much worse. She hissed, her voice a tight whisper of pure malice. "Riley," she spat, "what in God's name have you done?" I smiled, completely relaxed, and spread my hands toward the glittering spectacle. "I've complied, Victoria, just like your notice demanded. The old, unapproved pink is gone. I've repainted my house with exterior-grade paint, and I used a color that is not explicitly banned in your beloved guide. Find me the exact clause that bans electric lilac, Victoria. I'll wait." The crowd of neighbors, now a silent, gaping semicircle, watched the showdown unfold. The war was officially underway, and the purple house was its stunning, ridiculous monument. Victoria Sterling did not retreat. She simply escalated. Her initial horror at the sight of the electric lilac house quickly hardened into a cold, calculated fury. The day after the reveal, the HOA letters started arriving, not one by one, but in thick, heavy envelopes, each demanding immediate attention. They were a blizzard of bureaucracy. First, a $500 per day fine, retroactive to the date of the painting, citing the house as a public nuisance and gross violation of community aesthetic standards, even if they couldn't cite a specific color ban. Next, I received notice of an emergency HOA board meeting, scheduled for that evening. The pressure was immense. Victoria's strategy was clear. Hit Alex Riley with such overwhelming legal and financial force that he would surrender the paintbrush and submit to the grayscale rulebook. She believed that no single resident could withstand the unified power of the Assocation's legal team and its carefully constructed documentation. But Victoria failed to account for two things: my sense of humor and my knowledge of the digital age. I wasn't just a homeowner. I was a software architect. I understood systems, vulnerabilities, and the power of public opinion. I knew that fighting her in court would be expensive and slow, but fighting her online could be instantaneous and devastating. That very day, I set up a small, discreet camera on my porch and started recording everything. My first post, a short clip titled HOA President Victoria Sterling's Reaction to the Purple House, went live that evening. It featured Victoria's horrified whisper of "What have you done?" followed by my cool, collected legal counter-argument, all set to slightly dramatic music. The video was an instant hit, racking up thousands of views overnight. With comments pouring in from across the country about HOA absurdity, the digital counterattack was working, and it emboldened the physically present neighbors. The first one to break ranks was Sarah Jenkins, a quiet single mom who lived 2 doors down. She didn't approach my front door. Instead, one afternoon, she left a box of homemade cookies on my porch with a tiny, folded note that simply read, "Thank you." She fined me $50 for leaving my garden hose coiled on the driveway. Enough is enough. Other acts of passive support followed. Mr. Thompson, an elderly veteran, started deliberately leaving his unapproved rusty tractor on his lawn when Victoria drove by. Another neighbor secretly emailed me pages from the HOA bylaws that Victoria often misused. My purple house wasn't just a color. It was becoming a beacon for every person in Windsor Heights who felt stifled by Victoria's petty, absolute rule. The neighborhood was dividing. and the lines were drawn in electric lilac. Amidst the legal chaos and the rising neighborhood tension, a small, beautiful subplot emerged. A young girl named Lucy, about 6 years old, who lived with her parents across the street, started coming by every afternoon. She was fascinated by the house. She'd stand at the edge of my lawn, sketchbook in hand, drawing the shimmering walls. I learned that Lucy's favorite color was purple, and she thought my house looked like a magic castle. Her genuine joy in the face of Victoria's manufactured outrage was a constant reminder of why I was fighting. I gifted her a small canister of the electric lilac paint, the official color of the rebellion, and she painted a tiny wooden birdhouse in her yard. It was a small detail, but seeing her defiant little purple birdhouse next to my massive one gave me hope. This was about freedom and joy, not just property values. The emergency board meeting was a farce. Victoria, surrounded by Tamik board members, attempted to vote for immediate forced abatement, meaning they would hire a crew to paint over my house and charge me $10,000. But the meeting was interrupted by residents, some of whom were emboldened by my viral videos, which had now been picked up by local news. They stood up and detailed their own minor infractions: the wrong shade of roof shingle, the unapproved lawn statue, the Christmas lights left up 2 days too long. Victoria was losing control of the narrative, and the residents' anger was boiling over. Seeing her power slip, Victoria made a strategic retreat. She angrily announced that the board would follow proper legal procedure. The meeting concluded with a chilling final announcement: the HOA was scheduling a formal, binding community vote called the Abatement Vote. If the majority of residents voted yes, I would be legally required to paint the house a standard color within 7 days, or face the maximum lawsuit. The showdown was set, and the future of the Purple House, and possibly the entire neighborhood's freedom, would be decided by a ballot. The abatement vote was held in the Windsor Heights Community Center gymnasium. The atmosphere was thick with tension, far exceeding anything a local HOA meeting should generate. Nearly every homeowner was present, seated on folding chairs, divided into visible factions: Victoria's loyalists, the silent undecided, and the newly energized Alex supporters. Victoria Sterling stood at a podium, flanked by the 2 visibly nervous board members and an external attorney, Mr. Thompson, whose face clearly communicated he'd rather be anywhere else. Victoria addressed the crowd with chilling composure. "Neighbors," she began, her voice crisp and measured, "the abatement vote is simple. Yes or no. A yes vote mandates the immediate removal of the public nuisance at 14 Oakwood Lane, the hideous, sparkling purple house, and restoration to a respectable color, ensuring our property values and community standards are upheld." She then launched into a 10-minute monologue about fiscal responsibility, the sanctity of bylaws, and the dangerous precedent Alex had set. She ended by stating, with absolute confidence, that the board's legal counsel had confirmed they would win any lawsuit, meaning Alex would face financial ruin, and if the vote failed, it was my turn. I didn't approach the podium. I simply stood up where I was, holding a battered copy of the HOA bylaws. My goal wasn't to argue taste. It was to argue tyranny. "Victoria talks about standards and law," I began, my voice clear and projecting with shouting. "But the only standard she cares about is her own absolute control. She fined me for flowers, then forced me to repaint my old pink house. And when I followed the letter of the law, when I exposed the massive, absurd flaw in her vague non-residential hues rule, she didn't fix the rule. She tried to bankrupt me." I then spoke about the community, reading aloud Sarah Jenkins' note about the garden hose and mentioning how Lucy, the 6-year-old down the street, loved the house because it looked like a magic castle. I told them the vote wasn't about the purple. It was about whether they wanted to keep living under the oppressive, petty dictatorship of Victoria Sterling. The room was buzzing, the energy swinging wildly. The voting began immediately afterward. Ballots were cast in a locked box, and the count began behind a closed door. Victoria stood ramrod straight, a smirk slowly forming on her face as Mr. Thompson, the HOA attorney, whispered something reassuring to her. She looked at me, a silent, triumphant glare that said, "You lose, Riley." After 15 minutes, The counting was done. Victoria returned to the podium, her smile fixed and cruel. "The results are in," she announced, her voice booming. "The abatement vote passes. By a margin of 7 votes. The motion is carried. Mr. Riley, you have 7 days to return your house to an approved color, or the HOA will commence litigation and levy all associated costs." The room erupted. Victoria's allies cheered, while my supporters looked crestfallen. It was the moment of her ultimate victory, but I hadn't prepared a defense just for the vote. I had prepared a nuclear option for her expected victory. I stepped forward, holding my copy of the bylaws high. "I have one final motion, Madam President," I stated, cutting through the celebratory noise. Victoria frowned. "The vote is concluded. Mr. Riley, sit down. It's not about the vote," I countered sharply. "It's about this document." I flipped to a clearly tabbed section. Article 7, Section D, External Maintenance Responsibilities. This clause was added 10 years ago, during your first term, Victoria. It states that any homeowner who performs a full exterior repaint using an unlisted color, and whose property is subsequently cited as a public nuisance, is liable for all abatement costs, unless the new paint job uses a multi-component system designed for commercial-grade durability. I paused, letting the lawyer, Mr. Thompson, go pale. "I didn't just buy paint, Victoria. I used a custom-mixed, 2-component industrial coating with a specific glitter additive, designed for 15 years of heavy commercial use, a system that falls under the multi-component commercial-grade exception in your own Article 7. Section D." The rule was a tiny clause Victoria had inserted a decade ago to prevent cheap paint jobs on the clubhouse. The moment I cited it, the lawyer whispered loudly, "She's right, Victoria. It technically exempts him from mandatory abatement." Victoria Sterling's face went from triumph to utter devastation in seconds. She realized her own meticulous control had been weaponized against her. The vote, the fines, the threats, all nullified by a single, self-authored loophole. The community center descended into glorious chaos. Neighbors cheered, laughed, and demanded Victoria's immediate resignation. Victoria, utterly humiliated and legally defeated by her own paperwork, didn't say a word. She simply grabbed her beige clipboard, shoved past the stunned crowd, and fled the gymnasium. The war was over, and the Purple House had won. The gymnasium floor was the last battlefield. Victoria Sterling, defeated by her own overly complicated bylaws, never returned to the podium. Within 48 hours, an email was circulated not from her, but from a temporary HOA secretary stating Victoria had tendered her immediate resignation to personal reasons. The reign of the Queen of Beige was over. The Purple House, sparkling defiantly in the Connecticut sunshine, was safe. It wasn't just legally protected by the multi-component commercial-grade loophole I'd found. It was protected by the will of the community. The abatement vote had passed. Yes, but the subsequent reveal of Victoria's own legal blunder had invalidated the process and humiliated her beyond recovery. The HOA didn't try to challenge the rule again. They couldn't. They were too busy trying to figure out who was supposed to organize the next neighborhood picnic. The immediate aftermath was a period of glorious, if slightly disorganized, freedom. The HOA didn't collapse, but it became a shadow of its former, dictatorial self. The remaining board members, terrified of becoming the next viral villain, adopted a policy of extreme leniency. Sarah Jenkins still had her garden hose coiled on her driveway, but now it was a badge of honor. Mr. Thompson still left his rusty tractor out, and no one dared send a letter. The rules were still on the books, technically, but they had lost their power because the community had realized the rules were only as strong as the fear they generated. The neighborhood went from an immaculate, joyless estate to a slightly messy, more authentic American suburb. The perfect lawns started showing small patches of clover, and no one cared. For me, the cost of the war was real, but the rewards were unexpected. I spent thousands on the industrial-grade purple paint and a lot of late nights researching archaic bylaws, but I gained something far more valuable than the preservation of my home's pink heritage. I gained a community. Neighbors who had barely waved now stopped by for coffee, eager to share their own suppressed stories of Victoria's absurd finds. I wasn't just Alex Riley anymore. I was Alex Riley, the guy who beat the HOA. I realized that the fight wasn't just about my house. It was about the small, daily compromises people make just to keep the peace. Sometimes, you have to choose a public, loud rebellion to stop a quiet, creeping tyranny. And then there was Lucy. Her little purple birdhouse remained a permanent fixture in her yard. She would often leave me small drawings, always featuring a giant, glittering purple castle taped to my mailbox. That tiny, defiant birdhouse, inspired by my home, was the perfect symbol of the legacy I truly cared about. The purple house wasn't just a win for me. It was a silent promise to the next generation of Windsor Heights residents that their individuality wouldn't be crushed by a stern letter and a beige palette. Every morning, when the sun hit the glitter additive and my house shimmered, I felt a sense of pride that went beyond simple ownership. It was a monument to the spirit of a community that finally stood up to petty oppression. They wanted conformity. They demanded silence. But I gave them the loudest, most dazzling, and most legally binding declaration of independence they could ever imagine. The faded pink house was history. The sparkling, electric lilac house was the future. It stands there still, a vibrant, glittering middle finger to the soul-crushing conformity of suburbia, and it proved that sometimes the most effective rebellion starts with the wrong shade of paint.